bring in CNN Global Affairs analyst Kim Dozier and CNN Chief International Security Correspondent Nick Payton-Walsh for more on the global perspective here. You know, Kim, it's interesting because the Biden administration had this multi-nation prisoner swap. Yeah. And you have this multiple prisoner releases coming from Russia here. But what's so clear is that Russia does what it wants to do when it wants to do it for reasons that it sees in its interests. So I wonder how you are seeing this.
This is Vladimir Putin delivering to President Donald Trump a number of wins in his first month in office. Now, Mark Fogel, it's wonderful that he's out. It's wonderful for him, for his family, but let's remember that the hostage negotiator under the Biden administration, Roger Carstens, was the same hostage negotiator under the first Trump administration. He was a carryover, and that he'd worked to get Fogel out. But according to one State Department official I spoke to, the Russians didn't seem interested in exchanging him. This is carefully timed to get Trump on Putin's side ahead of these Ukrainian negotiations.
So, Nick, if this is a precursor to negotiations between the United States and Russia over the fate of Ukraine, what does this mean for Kyiv, especially as we're seeing Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth visiting with NATO leaders, saying that returning to that 2014 border with Russia is unrealistic?
Yeah, look, I mean, it must have been, I think, quite an uneasy day for Volodymyr Zelensky. He had thought perhaps on Friday, when Donald Trump said that they might meet this week, that he could in fact be discussing in person with Trump what the peace deal might look like. Instead, he got the US Treasury Secretary turning up in Kiev with essentially a financial type of deal defining their relationship with the United States going forwards. We don't know its full content. It probably involved rare earth minerals to some degree. But certainly during that failure to sign the deal, as perhaps had been expected by the Trump administration, news emerged that in fact Trump had been on another phone call talking to someone entirely different. Remember, this Ukrainian leader has been at the center of pretty much every room for the last 3 years when it comes to his Western allies, and suddenly he's seeing all of this diplomacy occurring without him often being in the room. He said today in an interview with The Economist that he didn't know what conversations Trump was having. He only heard about them in the press. That's such a stark difference. And we've seen this extraordinary moment of rehabilitation for Russia through the return of Mark Fogel, wrapped in the stars and stripes with Donald Trump. Essentially a move by the Kremlin, quite cynically here, to pave the way, to improve their image, to pave the way for Trump to perhaps make a deal that's more in their favor. We've known for some time that those around Trump and Trump himself haven't really felt that the US is getting much out of its support for Ukraine. Ukraine needs that support more than ever right now. And remarkably too, we heard from Hegseth in Brussels, the Secretary of Defense there, what we kind of knew: Ukraine's never going to get back to its 2014 borders. They tried in 2023 with a counter-offensive. That failed, and they're not going to become part of NATO. We knew that was the case too, but it's said there very openly, very loud, and also something too that Ukraine urgently wanted, which is American peacekeepers as part of any peacekeeping force. We're far off that idea right now, but the notion of the US kind of saying to its European allies, fixing this, policing this, sorting this out, it's on you. We're no longer the guarantor of European security. That's a huge sea change, and it's one that essentially says to Ukraine, you better go along with whatever he presents, or you might be on your own. And we don't know the full extent of what Trump and Putin talked about for 90 full minutes, probably their second call in about a week. Trump alluded to another one at the weekend. He rang Zelensky second to update him on that, and I think that is all you need to know about where Kiev stand in the pecking order here. This peace deal is likely to be between Russia and the United States, telling Ukraine what they think is its best path going forwards. That is a marked change and will leave many Ukrainians deeply concerned, and many troops on the front lines fighting for Ukraine perhaps wondering exactly what their efforts and loss is for right now.
Sure. Kim, I wonder, to Nick's point, if Trump's view of foreign policy is purely one based on transactions and what ultimately it will benefit the United States, benefit him, what does Ukraine have to offer? Is it these rare earth minerals? Is that leverage to get Trump to try to push for more out of the Kremlin?
Yeah, I did speak to a Ukrainian contact who was briefed on what went on in Ramstein and said that they're very upset with what Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said about this resolution is probably not going to include Ukraine as part of NATO, that you're not going to see a return to Ukraine's 2014 borders. All bad news. The one bright silver lining here is that Trump has sent his Treasury Secretary to Kyiv to discuss access to rare earth minerals. So the Ukrainians are hoping that maybe that is something that they hold in the balance. I also understand that Hegseth, behind closed doors, got pretty savaged by other attendees, saying, what, so you guys are pulling out? And reassured them that no, the U.S. isn't abandoning this, it's just that you all have to step up. So they kind of took his comments publicly as a signal to, it's what the White House wants to hear. And though that is also disturbing, that the White House wants to hear what comments that would be welcomed in Russia, that signal that Russia will be able to keep at least some of the territory that it has taken by force since 2014.
Yeah, and those sort of things, Nick, being undercut, the idea of you're not going to be in NATO, right? You're going to have to give up your claim to territory. Coming out of the gate before negotiations even begin and making it clear that Ukraine can't stand well or solidly on firm ground to argue that they deserve those things, where does that leave them in these negotiations?
Yeah, it leaves Trump and essentially NATO with no room to bluff here. They've laid their cards flat on the table in the first move. And I think this means a negotiator like Putin, who's been waiting for this moment of Western disunity for the whole 3 years of this war, he's been allowing, thousands of his own people to die or be wounded at times every day or week, just to buy time until this change in heart, where we see NATO having to deal with the fact that Europe isn't putting as much in as the United States, is not in this necessarily indefinitely, even though it says it wants to be, waiting for this moment of fracture and the inevitable truth that, yeah, Ukraine isn't going to be part of NATO. It never was. It isn't unlikely to be for a decade. That's been a known. But the fact this has been so boldly stated, comforting as that is to the sort of the grassroots Trump agenda that got him into power, it leaves these negotiations in a very dangerous place, because we don't know what Trump and Putin are talking about the entire time. We don't know how much sympathy Trump has for Putin's position in some of these areas too, but we do know that his alliance with Zelensky is certainly not paramount. He's not been the one receiving the calls or having the meetings, and I think that is extremely telling for where we are going forwards. This peace process is underway, but remember, Russia is winning on the ground, so the clock is not ticking loudly in its ears, certainly is in Zelensky's, who's running out of people and weaponry.
Nick Payton-Walsh, Kim Dozier, appreciate you both. Thanks for joining us.